Hello, young soul. I never imagined that simply being the director of an orphanage could bring me so close to a nightmare. When I accepted the position, I knew the place had its weight. Orphanages, after all, always have something dark about them. But in that small town, nestled between mountains and with few entertainment options, the orphanage was seen as a pillar of the community. In the eyes of the locals, it was a safe place where orphaned children could grow up without the pain of loneliness. But there was something about the orphanage that didn't feel right. Something that unsettled my mind every time I walked through the silent halls at night. It was a large, old building, with creaking floors and walls that somehow seemed to breathe. The smell of mold was constant, but what really bothered me were the rumors. Rumors about the basement. I had always heard stories about that place, stories that the children whispered to each other. They said the basement hid strange things, things that shouldn't be seen. And when the disappearances began, everything became even more disturbing. Children vanished without explanation. They simply disappeared, and no one ever knew where they went. The other staff were nervous, but I felt that something was approaching, that the truth was right there before my eyes, waiting to be uncovered. It was on a rainy night, after the last child disappeared, that I decided to go down to the basement. I knew something had to be done, that this feeling of discomfort wasn't just my paranoia. When I reached the basement stairs, the wooden door felt heavier than usual, as if resisting my presence. I knew no one had gone down there for years. The smell of dampness was almost unbearable, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The light from my lighter flickered in my hands, illuminating only a fraction of the path ahead of me. I descended, and the steps creaked under my weight. Each step was a loud and cruel sound in the stillness of the night. When I reached the bottom, the silence was absolute. I looked around and realized the basement was larger than I had imagined. But it wasn't that which made me stop. No. What made me stop was the gaze of the old rusty metal frame on the wall. It was hidden behind piles of boxes and broken furniture, as if trying to hide from me. It was a locked room. When I saw the lock, I realized it wasn't there by accident. Someone wanted to hide what was inside. I didn't know what could be so terrible that it needed to be kept hidden like that. But the feeling that something was about to be revealed pushed me forward. I broke the lock with a key I had found in the office. It had been kept, lonely, without explanation. And the door opened. What I found inside the room left me speechless. It was a simple room, but what was in it was not. Dark wood-paneled walls, a cracked cement floor, and in the center, a steel table. On top of the table, a series of documents and photos were spread out. The first thing I saw was the name of each missing child. There were more than the known cases. More than I had imagined. But the most disturbing part wasn't the records. It wasn't the notes about the disappearances. What froze me completely was the first photo I found. It showed a girl, about 10 years old. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. They were empty. Her body was contorted, as if it had been positioned incorrectly. Her arms bent backward, her legs at an impossible angle, and the expression on her face. I didn't know how to describe it, but it was as if she was being forced to do something against her will. I walked over to the table to see more photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Children with impossible postures, their faces disfigured in expressions of pain, but something more. Something supernatural. I didn't know what it was, but something told me it wasn't human. And then, upon turning a yellow sheet of paper, I found the explanation. The text was confusing, but what was written made me break out in a cold sweat. It was a report from someone who called themselves the doctor. It spoke of experiments, of physical and psychological modifications made on the children, and what chilled me the most was the last sentence. They are ready for the next stage. They will never be the same. It was then that true terror descended upon me. I knew there was something more beneath, something being done in the shadows, away from everyone. Something the city had never known. And, as I turned the last page of the report, I found a list with more names. And mine was there. When I saw my name on that list, I felt a deep vertigo, a sensation that the ground beneath my feet was giving way. It was as if my very existence had been manipulated, forged by something I could never comprehend. I couldn't process the idea that somehow I was part of that story, A story of manipulation, of pain, of something monstrous. I turned the last page of the report with trembling hands, and that's where I found the most horrifying description of all. The doctor, whom I imagined was just a ghostly figure amid the chaos, explained what was really happening in that orphanage, and what they were trying to do with the children. The text said, "Full adaptation to the final stage is achieved through pain. Pain transforms, reveals the true self. The process takes time, but those who resist are discarded. Those who become more are used as raw material for what is to come." My body was paralyzed with terror. The idea that something so horrific was being carried out in that place, right under our noses, made me feel nauseous. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the words on the paper. No. The most disturbing thing was the sound coming from behind me. A faint creak, as if something was moving in the darkness of the basement. The heat of my breath quickened as the sound approached. I tried to turn around, but fear held me back. I was overwhelmed by a sensation that I was no longer alone. Something was there, watching. I felt the eyes of an invisible presence fixed on me. Suddenly, the light from my lighter flickered and went out. The basement was swallowed by absolute darkness. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own racing heartbeats, loud and deafening. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the house itself was breathing with me. Then I heard a whisper, a low and almost unintelligible sound. It was a voice, or several, speaking at once, but with an almost hypnotic tone. And that feeling that something was there, with me, made me freeze in place. I knew I was about to confront something I couldn't endure. The darkness seemed to move, as if it had a life of its own. I strained my eyes, trying to distinguish any shape, any movement, but what I saw was even more terrifying. It was as if the shadow twisted, took form, and suddenly the floor in front of me was illuminated by a faint light, but intense enough to reveal a figure. A child, not much taller than a 10-year-old boy, was there, but its appearance was distorted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were enormous, as if forced open in a way that human anatomy wouldn't allow. Its arms were so thin, so elongated, that they seemed to have no muscles, just threads. And its fingers, looked like claws, curved and bloody. That child was not a child. It was something I could no longer call human. It didn't speak, but its eyes were fixed on me, and I could feel the pain, the loss, and the loneliness emanating from it. I knew that child had gone through everything the report described. It was one of the victims, but it was no longer a victim. It had become something different, something much worse. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my feet were paralyzed, and my mind couldn't process what was happening. When I finally mustered the courage to move, the child, or whatever it was, took a step toward me. Its steps were light, silent, but there was an agony in each one, a visible torture in its movement. And then, in the deathly silence of the basement, it whispered, "You will join us." The words dragged like a cold chain around my neck. I tried to run, but when I made the move, I realized the entire basement seemed to have changed. The walls were closer, the air heavier. The stairs leading to the exit felt distant, unreachable. The space around me seemed to shrink, as if I were trapped inside a growing nightmare. I looked back and saw the shadows clustering. Other figures began to emerge from the darkness, children, but not children. They were deformed, their skin torn, their bodies contorted in grotesque positions. Their eyes had no more life, but their mouths moved, forming words that were impossible to understand. They were surrounding me. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. They knew what I had done. They knew I had uncovered the secrets of the orphanage. I could no longer escape. I was part of the process. I was a piece in the experiment, an experiment that had now become a curse. In a last act of desperation, I tried to run to the stairs. But before I could take the first step, something grabbed me by the shoulder. An inhuman force, cold as death, pulled me back. I turned to face the thing holding me, and what I saw made me wish I had never opened that damn door. The child was there, but no longer just her. She was accompanied. The figure now staring at me with those empty, wild eyes was the doctor. His face was deformed, as if time had torn his skin, and his hands, filled with needles and blades, slowly approached me. "You won't escape," he said, his voice icy and filled with a sick pleasure. And it was then that I realized I was already part of the experiment. I was the last child on the list. And nothing, not even death, could save me now. I could no longer move my feet. Fear immobilized me, not as a mere sensation but as a real, embodied presence that made me feel as if my flesh was being slowly consumed. Those deformed children, or whatever they were, began to approach me. Their empty, inhuman gazes said nothing but conveyed everything. The silence, once frightening, grew more deafening with each step. And I was surrounded. The doctor stood before me, and he was no longer wearing the visage of a human being. His face seemed to have been carved by pain itself. The lines of his face twisted grotesquely, as if the flesh were being torn from within. His hands, filled with torturous tools, were covered in blood that seemed to have been there for years, a mark of his insane acts. "You are so close," he whispered, drawing nearer, "to the point of no return. To the point where pain, anguish, death no longer matter." I tried to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was so tight, as if it were being squeezed by an invisible force. The air in my lungs vanished, and I felt like I was being swallowed by the very darkness around me. "These children, they were never, as you think," the doctor continued, his voice filled with a strange satisfaction. "They're not here by accident. They are what we made them. You'll understand." A shiver ran down my spine. I knew he was referring to the experiments, the photos, the deformities, those empty eyes. But something inside me told me this was just the beginning. Something much worse was about to happen. I tried to step back, but the shadows were no longer just around me. They were moving. They were inside me. I could feel the hands of each of those hooded figures reaching toward my body, inflicting immense pain on every part of me, as if my skin were being ripped apart from within. That room, the basement, the orphanage, everything seemed to disappear, consumed by a new reality. A reality made of pain. I no longer knew where I was, what was real, and what was happening. In a final effort, I tried to scream, but the pain piercing my chest was so great that it made me lose consciousness for a moment. I fell to the ground, my hands bleeding, my legs unable to support my body. I was at their mercy, and I knew that what was coming next would have no turning back. The room that once seemed cold and lifeless was now alive, pulsating. I saw the walls breathing, the gazes of the deformed children as if they knew what was to come, and the doctor, smiling at me with devilish delight, approached. "You will be the last piece, the last experiment. The cycle is complete. Now you will be like them." Those words echoed in my mind. The cycle? What did he mean by that? Before I could comprehend, an immense pain took over my body. It wasn't just physical. It was a mental pain, a soul pain, as if something were being ripped from me. I wanted to close my eyes, wanted to surrender to the darkness and disappear from that place, but I couldn't. Because when I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection on the ground. Several figures, not just the children, but other human forms. Distorted shapes, intertwined with shadows, their eyes fixed on me. I felt a sensation of being part of something, an experiment, a creation, an abomination. And the pain consuming my body now seemed to be a part of me that could no longer escape. The faces of the children, with their empty expressions, twisted in a way that I knew the transformation had begun. The doctor was now by my side, his hands holding something, a long needle with a thick black liquid. "Now," he said, his voice becoming a whisper, "you will be one of them. The pain, the loss, the emptiness, you will finally understand what it means to be truly part of the process." And before I could do anything, he injected the liquid into my vein. The effect was immediate. My body began to transform. Not physically, not in a way I could see with my eyes. But inside me, something was changing. I could feel my being torn apart, as if something inside me was stretching, distorting, and the pain only intensified. It was as if time itself had stopped, as if I were being consumed by an infinite darkness that engulfed me completely. And then, in the last gasp, I understood what was happening. I wasn't just being transformed physically. I was being remade, recreated. and the doctor was responsible for it all. When the pain finally ceased, and I could no longer distinguish what was me and what were the other shadows around me, the final words of the doctor haunted me, still echoing in my mind. "You are now part of our family." I no longer knew who I was. The memories of my old life, when I was the director, began to fade, as if they were being slowly erased by the pain and transformation that consumed me. The doctor had done his job. He had shaped me, but not just physically. He had stripped me of all humanity, all reason, every trace of being human. What remained was no longer me. The room was silent, but there was a pulsing. Something moving in the walls, in the shadows, in the dense air that seemed to weigh on my soul. I was standing now, but I didn't feel the ground beneath my feet. It was as if I were floating in a parallel reality, where everything around me was made of pain, fear, and emptiness. But as I looked around, I saw something that made me realize I was not alone. The figures, those deformed children, were around me. Now, I didn't just see their empty eyes and twisted bodies. I saw their mouths open, smiling. But those smiles were not human. They were smiles distorted by pain, loss, and terror. I was one of them now. The doctor approached once more, his figure now almost imperceptible in the darkness, his hands touching my skin, his gaze fixed and vacant, as if he had been consumed by his own experiment. His eyes were sunken, as if he had lost his soul long ago. "You don't understand, do you?" he whispered, his voice an echo distorted in the void. "You never understood what we really did here. We weren't creating monsters. We were creating what was always meant to be." I couldn't grasp what he meant, but something within me, something deep and primal, began to understand. I was trapped in a cycle. The cycle of transformation he had started, which he had created with his blood-stained and cruel hands. "No," he said, stepping back slowly. "You will be what they were. What I am. What we all are." I looked around, the shadowy figures beginning to move. They were no longer just deformities. They were memories. Of every child that had disappeared. Of every soul that had been destroyed to satisfy the doctor's desires. They were fragments, pieces of something much larger. It was then that I saw the worst. That room, the basement, the orphanage, it was not just a place of experiments. It was a prison. A prison of souls, a place where the victims were doomed to live forever, condemned to be transformed, undone, consumed by pain and emptiness. And I was now a part of it. Part of what the doctor had created. In the corner of the room, where I once thought there was a door, a dark opening formed. An opening that emitted a deep sound, like a vortex, a black hole. I knew what it was. I knew there was no turning back. The doctor smiled at me, but not with a triumphant smile. It was something darker, more repulsive. Something that made me realize I would not be freed. No one else would be. "You have always been a pawn, my dear," he said, his voice now sounding like a threat. "And now you will understand." He made a gesture, and the shadows began to approach. They were no longer the deformed figures. They were the souls. The souls of all the children he had tortured, whom he had used as pieces in his macabre game. And in an instant, the shadows took shape, and I knew what it meant to be consumed by them. It was the end. The doctor vanished into the darkness, and I, now with a final scream that did not escape my throat, found myself sinking into the abyss, lost forever. And it was then that I understood the true meaning of those words, the last words he had spoken to me. "You are now part of our family." When I finally managed to stand up, I was no longer myself. The walls of the room began to dissolve, revealing the true horrors of the orphanage. The floor was covered with human remains, the bodies of the children that the doctor had turned into monsters, now serving as the foundation for what remained of those decaying walls. But the worst was not the sight of the rotting corpses around me, nor the feeling of being trapped in an eternal nightmare. The worst was the sound I heard. It was laughter, faint and distant, but familiar, like echoes of a past I was trying to forget. The laughter came from within me. I had become one of the shadows, one of the lost souls, and now, I too was trapped, forever, in that macabre cycle. I was 10 years old when I entered the orphanage. I don't have clear memories of how it all happened, but I remember being pushed into a cold, impersonal world, where faces and names blended together. But there was one thing that marked me more than anything else at that time: Elisa. She wasn't like the other children. While everyone else played or chatted with each other, Elisa remained alone. She was a fragile-looking girl, with straight black hair that fell to her shoulders, always tidy, but her eyes, those eyes, were what disturbed me the most. They had a strange glimmer, as if reflecting something I couldn't understand, something that made me feel like I was being watched at all times. I got used to seeing her gaze from afar, as if she were always in a corner, observing, never engaging. She seemed to be part of those cold walls, as if she belonged to the place, to its essence. No one knew for sure where she came from. She never spoke about her previous life. She just appeared one morning and was placed in the house, like a specter from some other time, lost and out of place. Elisa never slept. That was the first sign that something was off. The other children laughed, cried, slept, and played, but she remained quiet at night. I had heard stories about people who didn't need to sleep, or who couldn't, but none of those accounts compared to what I saw with her. It was as if she lived in a different world. I often saw her in the shadows of the corridor, her eyes shining as if reflecting the light of something invisible. She would stand there, motionless, watching, never uttering a word. It didn't matter if it was night or day, she was always there, as if she were part of the orphanage itself. But it was on one of those nights that things began to change. I was awake, which wasn't unusual. The silence of the orphanage was deep and uncomfortable, as if the walls were compressing the air, making it hard to breathe. Something felt wrong in that place, but I couldn't identify what. Then, it was when I passed by the corridor and saw something that chilled my blood. Elisa was there. In one of the corners, the dim light of the lamp flickered, casting distorted shadows. Her eyes were fixed on me, and for a second, I swore I saw something beyond the gaze of a mere child. There was something strange, almost predatory. What unsettled me the most was her position. She was lying on the floor, her eyes still illuminated by the dying light of the lamp, as if she were waiting for me to pass. I said nothing. I just kept walking, but a chill ran down my spine, making me quicken my pace to my room. In the following days, things began to get even stranger. Items started to disappear. It wasn't anything valuable, but small things vanished without explanation. At first, I thought the children were just playing with each other, accidentally taking what didn't belong to them. But the frequency with which things disappeared was starting to become unusual. A pair of shoes, an old doll, even books. And somehow, everything seemed to revolve around Elisa. I saw her several times looking at the missing objects with a strange expression, as if she knew exactly where they were but refused to say anything. That was when I found the drawing. It was on the floor, somewhat crumpled, as if it had been left there by someone who didn't want it to be found. It was a simple drawing, yet disturbing at the same time. Human figures with animal heads. I didn't know exactly what those images meant, but one of them was too strange. It was looking at me. A figure with the head of a deer, its eyes fixed on me. It wasn't just a gaze from someone drawing a figure. It was a gaze from someone who was watching me. And more terrifying was the fact that this drawing had been made by Elisa. Those images stayed in my mind all night. I couldn't sleep, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow seemed to have a life of its own, and the sound of the house, well, the sound of the house, which would normally be ordinary in an orphanage, felt different at that moment. The noise of the wind in the trees, the creaking of the old building, everything sounded louder, sharper. That night, after a long time trying to close my eyes, I decided to investigate. I got out of my bed and, with my heart racing, approached the director's door, the only one who seemed to know more about Elisa. When I carefully opened it, I saw a scene I would never forget. The director was in his office, but he wasn't alone. Elisa was there, standing next to him. She wasn't speaking, but she was looking directly at him, as if engaged in a silent conversation. But the strangest thing of all was how the director was behaving. He wasn't calm anymore, as he always seemed to be. His eyes were wide, and he was speaking to her in a strange way. Something about his posture was off. He was tense, restless, as if he were trying to hide something. When I realized he was watching me through the slightly open door, I froze, not knowing what to do. He seemed to know I was there, but Elisa didn't move. She didn't seem to care. She continued to watch him, her eyes fixed and empty, as if something else was happening there, something I couldn't understand. Then the door suddenly closed, leaving me with a growing sense of fear. I didn't know what was happening between the director and Elisa, but one thing was clear: this was no longer an orphanage. Something was very, very wrong, and I was about to find out what it was. I had the feeling that I was being followed, even when I was alone. The director and Elisa, that night, left me with a lump in my throat. What was between them? What was happening in that place? I wondered if it was already too late to leave, but something compelled me to stay and find out more. In the following days, a strange calm hung over the orphanage. The children were quieter, the atmosphere heavier. I could no longer look at the shadows the same way. They slithered through the hallways, as if they were alive, lurking in every corner. I started to avoid the places where Elisa used to be. But of course, she always found me. Her nighttime visits became more frequent, more intense. That night, I was returning from the cafeteria and, as I passed through the hallway, I saw Elisa again. She was leaning against the wall, near the old wall clock, her eyes fixed on me. But something was different. There was something in her gaze. It was no longer just an unsettling glimmer. It was a hungry gleam, as if she were watching prey. As I approached, she didn't move. She just kept her eyes locked on me, watching as if she knew I was about to do something I shouldn't. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the end of the hallway. A dragging, heavy sound. I turned to look and saw a shadow moving, very large and distorted. The lights flickered and made the walls bend in a grotesque way. The sound of heavy footsteps reverberated, but there was no one visible. I tried to run, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. When I looked back at Elisa, she was gone. Fear was consuming me, but I couldn't turn back. I headed toward the director's office, determined to find out what he was doing with Elisa, what was happening there. But when I opened the door, something paralyzed me. The office was empty. There was nothing in the place. The desk was clean, the drawers open, but nothing was there, as if everything had been forcefully removed. The atmosphere felt abandoned, but the air was saturated with a sense of presence, as if something was waiting to make me turn back. Suddenly, the sound of light bulbs bursting echoed throughout the building, leaving a disturbing silence in their place. And then, the lights went out. Panic completely overtook me, but when I tried to run back, something else started to happen. The walls were closing in. Not literally, of course, but the environment began to feel more oppressive, as if the building were against me, as if it were swallowing me whole. I passed through the hallway and heard whispers, low and shallow murmurs coming from every corner. They were speaking in strange tones, words I couldn't understand, but that seemed familiar. I could almost see the shadows writhing, taking shape, breathing. What was that? I was lost, the way back seemed distant, and when I looked to the side, I saw something that froze me inside. Elisa was there, standing at the end of the corridor. But now, she was no longer alone. There was a figure beside her, so tall it almost touched the ceiling. Its silhouette was distorted and shapeless, with long, disproportionate limbs. I couldn't see its face, but I knew that somehow, it was what had been watching me. The shadows around it moved in a way that was unnatural. It was as if the shadows were a part of it, stretching and writhing. I was paralyzed, unable to look away. The footsteps echoed again, but this time they were different. They were heavy steps, yet strangely rhythmic, as if moving with a will of their own. When the figure moved, the shadows followed. I could hear its whispers now. They were words, but not human words. They were incomprehensible sounds, but I felt a pressure in my mind, as if that language was trying to enter me, devour everything I knew, and transform me into something that would no longer be me. As the footsteps approached, the figure beside Elisa looked directly at me. Its eyes, they were not eyes. They were holes, empty circles that emanated a darkness so dense I could barely breathe. With each passing second, the pressure increased, and fear took over my body like poison. Suddenly, as if knowing I no longer had the strength to flee, the figure spoke. not in words but in a pulse in my head. I heard the voice, and at the same time, felt the pain of the words piercing my mind like sharp blades. You should not have come here. You should not have seen what was not meant to be seen. I tried to scream, but the voice was trapped in my throat, as if there wasn't enough air to make a sound. The silence was deafening. When I tried to take a step back, I realized the corridor was closing in around me, and the dark was becoming denser, more present. There was no escape anymore. And finally, as if it had all been a game, Elisa spoke. Her tone was low, almost a whisper, but her words sliced through the darkness with precision. You've seen too much. Now you cannot leave. And it was at that moment, with the shadows swallowing every piece of me, that I understood. Elisa was not just a quiet girl. She was there to guard the secret of something much deeper. Something no one should know. Something I should never have discovered. And then silence. Darkness. And an even deeper, older presence enveloping me, consuming me. I felt a pressure in my chest. Fear was crushing me from within, but at the same time, something kept me there. Something that was no longer me, but whatever was taking my place. Elisa's eyes fixed on me, but now there was something more, something that seemed to grow in those shadows, like a shape that did not want to be seen but was expanding with every moment. That hallway, which had once seemed empty and unsustainable, was now transforming into something deeper, darker. The walls began to move, as if they were breathing, exhaling a metallic, damp smell that invaded my nostrils. I could no longer distinguish if I was breathing or being sucked in by that thing that did not want me to know. I still tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if every muscle had been drained, as if my very life was being siphoned by the darkness. Elisa was so close that her empty eyes began to dilate, absorbing the light around her, becoming part of the darkness itself. I sensed there was something more inside her, something that should not be there. She was no longer human. She was filled with ruins, as if a greater creature had taken her body. Something that did not belong to the world we knew. That's when I saw the drawing, the same drawing I had seen before, but now with a difference. It was no longer on a piece of paper. It was on the walls. The figures of men with animal heads were everywhere in the hallway, and worst of all, one of them was looking at me, directly into my eyes. I don't know how, but I felt its gaze as if I was being observed by every detail of that creature, every twisted line drawn with grotesque perfection. The air felt charged with an impossible density, as if the walls were breathing with a will of their own. The sound of shadows moving, crawling along the floor, mingling with the beats of my heart. I didn't want to, but I was starting to feel a warmth, a strange sensation, as if I was becoming comfortable there. As if the darkness was a comforting thing. I tried to pull away, but I could no longer move. My legs were trapped, my mind clouding over, until a chill ran down my spine. I turned and saw the director. He was standing there at the end of the hallway, watching me with a vacant, lifeless smile. His eyes, those empty eyes, had no pupils. I could feel that he was no longer alive. He was no longer a human being. He was part of that place, an extension of the shadows, of those walls. He was no longer governing the orphanage. He was the orphanage. You won't be able to escape, he said, his voice low yet cutting. She has already chosen you. I tried to scream, but my voice was failing, as if it were being torn from within me. I looked at Elisa, but she was different. Her face was now distorted, no longer a child. Her skin was pale and covered in marks, as if something had grown beneath it, something viscous and repulsive. Her mouth was open, but she wasn't speaking. She smiled, a crooked smile that seemed to tear across her face, as if the flesh were stretching too much. She no longer looked human. She was something that had been consumed by darkness. Don't you understand? The director whispered, as if he were talking about something ordinary. She is the key. She always has been. Panic took hold of me. I no longer knew if I was in a nightmare, or if this was really happening. But the feeling that the entire place was against me, that every shadow, every breath, every sigh, was trying to drag me into an abyss, left me breathless. I could no longer breathe normally. The air was tainted, as if I were inhaling the very memories of everyone who had passed through here and never left. The smell of death and hopelessness was embedded in everything. The director's footsteps echoed behind me. I could no longer run. It was as if the ground itself was holding me down, as if the shadows were rising and swallowing me. When I looked ahead, I saw Elisa, or what was left of her, approaching. She didn't move with her feet, but floated. The ground seemed to bend beneath her, as if the space around her was molding itself to her will. They always end up like this, she murmured in a voice that didn't seem like hers. They always become part of me, part of the whole. I tried to step back, but with every step I took, the corridor seemed to stretch further, the place distorting, folding, as if it were trying to swallow me. There was no exit. I already knew that. Elisa and the director were right. There was no way out anymore. The place began to close in around me. I could no longer see the walls, only a deep, impenetrable darkness. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heavy, anguished breathing. A feeling of morbid ecstasy took over me, as if I were about to lose myself completely. And then I heard one last thing, a whisper coming from all directions. And at the same time, from my own mind. Now you are one of them. And finally, I felt the presence of Elisa and the director drawing near, as if they were now part of me too, as if the darkness had consumed them, and I was being consumed as well. I don't know if I woke up. I don't know if the orphanage is still there. What I know is that whenever I close my eyes, I see Elisa. Always. She is watching me. She will always watch me. I was beginning to lose the ability to distinguish what was real and what was a product of my mind. The orphanage, that place that once seemed familiar, now disintegrated into shadows before my eyes. The darkness spread throughout the surroundings, as if it had gained a life of its own, swallowing everything around it, making the light a distant memory, an illusion I was trying, futilely, to reach. The director's footsteps approached again, but this time, they were not just footsteps. There was something more. As if he were a part of the darkness itself, infiltrating every crack, every fragment of what remained of those moldy, decaying walls. I could feel his presence, not with my ears, but with my skin, with my bones. He was inside me now, his words echoing in my head like a funeral chant. You are part of this now. I turned to Elisa, who stood still, watching me with those dilated, empty eyes, as if she knew something I still could not comprehend. She was no longer a child. I realized then that she had never been a child. She had always been the essence of that place, a manifestation of the evil rooted in the very soil of the orphanage. She was the spirit of that house, the demon that kept everyone there, trapped in an invisible prison. That's when she spoke. Not with the voice I knew, but with something deeper, more cavernous. The voice seemed to come from all corners, from within the walls, from inside my mind. I am what remains, she said, her mouth moving but without sound. I am the void that devours what is left, what cannot be forgotten. And then something began to happen. The shadows started to move around me, with a life of their own. They were no longer just the walls, no longer just the drawn figures. They were no longer Elisa's eyes. They were the memories. I saw the faces of the children who had passed through there. I saw their eyes, their expressions of terror and despair. I saw their bodies, already decayed and aged by time, but still there, trapped, immortalized in the darkness, as if the orphanage were an eternal prison for their souls. They were screaming, begging for help, but their mouths were stitched shut, their eyes sealed. They could no longer speak. They could no longer escape. I stepped back, but the darkness surrounded me more and more. I felt the icy hands of something touching me, pulling me into that mass of darkness taking shape. The heat of my own breath seemed to suffocate me, and fear overwhelmed me in a way I never thought possible. There was no more air. There was no more hope. I looked at Elisa, or what remained of her, and saw a smile. Not a human smile, but a monstrous, twisted grin, as if she were reveling in the pain, in the agony that consumed me. She was no longer a child. She was the feeling that place fed upon. She was the very fear that lived there. They are inside you now, she whispered, with a voice that was not hers. You can no longer leave. I looked at the director, but he was no longer there. He had dissolved into the darkness, becoming part of something greater, something unimaginable. What remained of his presence was the void, a feeling that nothing had ever mattered, that nothing ever would. I was inside that nightmare now, with no way out. I was no longer myself. I had been absorbed, not just by the orphanage, but by everything it represented, by the pain of all those who had passed through there and had never been freed. I was part of that house, those walls, those screams. I was them. I had become part of something greater, something that could not be destroyed. And before I completely lost consciousness, one last vision formed before me. Elisa's face, her dark and deep eyes shining with a light that was not of this world, slowly approaching. I knew she would not let me go. I knew that somewhere, I was there forever. Now you understand, she said, her voice now calm, almost complacent. I am what will never cease, and you will be the next to join us. And at the moment darkness swallowed me, I knew I was doomed. Not just to that house, but to something deeper. Something beyond a simple death. I had become part of the orphanage. A story that would never end. Do you believe that everything you see can disappear in an instant? Or is it that what truly disappears is the truth? I still remember the first time I saw Lucas. He was about 7, maybe 8 years old, and he had arrived at the orphanage with the vacant stare of someone who had seen things no one should see. He was a different child. He didn't talk, didn't play with the other boys. His expression was always the same, emotionless, just a fixed gaze, as if he were always observing something beyond what the rest of us could perceive. I worked in that place for over 15 years, and I can assure you that, over the years, I learned to recognize the small signs that something was wrong. The orphanage had a heavy atmosphere, as if its walls were absorbing all the pain and suffering of the children who passed through there. There was always something suffocating in the air. But Lucas, he seemed to be in tune with it, as if he were part of that place in a deeper way than the others. Sometimes, while the others slept, I would find him in the dark hallway, silent, always standing still, looking at a wall or into the void. Nobody understood what he wanted or thought, and no one dared to ask. There was one night when the atmosphere in the orphanage was tenser than ever. A storm began to form outside, and the sky darkened so quickly that it felt like night had fallen upon us. During dinner, the lights began to flicker, blinking and shaking, until finally, the entire building was engulfed in darkness. That's when I heard the screams. I was in the staff room, trying to find a flashlight, when the sound of the children screaming began to fill the silence. It was a mix of fear and panic, as if something was approaching them. My heart raced. I ran to the dining hall, but I saw nothing but chaos. The children were trembling, some standing, others hiding under tables, but no one could explain what had caused that panic. And it was at that moment that I noticed. Lucas wasn't there. He had never joined the others for meals, but he was always around, watching. He liked to be near, even without interacting. But this time, he wasn't. I scanned the room, but nothing. I decided to search the upper floor. I heard the footsteps before I got there. Small, light steps, as if someone were walking barefoot. But there was no one else in the building, just the children. I was sure of it. The noise came from the end of the hallway. I followed the sound to the stairs, where shadows formed with a strange intensity. I stopped at the base of the stairs and then, up above, I saw something that made me freeze. Lucas was at the bathroom door. But he wasn't standing still, as usual. No, he was looking inside, not moving. His eyes were so fixed it seemed like he was absorbing whatever was behind that door. His hand was outstretched, as if trying to reach for something, but his body was leaning forward, as if it were trapped there. I shouted his name, but he didn't respond. As I went to climb the stairs, a cold wind cut across my face like an invisible hand. I hesitated, but then I saw him move. Lucas turned slowly, his gaze still fixed, but now something seemed different. His eyes, His eyes were no longer empty. There was something in them, something I had never seen before. They were as if absorbing the light, as if they wanted to swallow everything around. He smiled. It was a strange smile, a smile that seemed to come from a place it shouldn't. And then he said, in a voice almost inaudible yet still clear, "I'm leaving, and you will regret not coming with me." I still couldn't process that when the light returned. The lamps flickered and for a moment, the orphanage seemed to breathe back to life. But when the lights came on, Lucas was no longer there. I ran through the building, searching for him, but I never found him. And even stranger was that, the next morning, no one remembered anything. The children didn't talk about what had happened, and no one seemed bothered by the fact that Lucas was missing. But things didn't end there. Not for me. Every night, laughter began to echo through the orphanage, soft at first, as if someone was having fun somewhere distant. When I went to check, I found no one. And even when I tried to sleep, the laughter seemed to draw closer, more and more, as if it were inside my room. And I knew Lucas was still there. But now, he was no longer alone. I just didn't know how far he had sped throughout that house. I should have left the orphanage that night when the feeling that something was wrong wrapped around me like a cloak. But instead I stayed. I continued to work there, as if Lucas's presence, or whatever he had become, was nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. But I was wrong. Very wrong. As the days passed, things became even stranger. The children seemed altered, as if they were in a state of constant hypnosis. They didn't talk to each other, and it wasn't that they had lost interest in playing or socializing. It was something deeper, something as if their souls were absent, as if they were being watched all the time. And then the whispers began. I heard every night whispers coming from the hallways, whispers that didn't come from the children. I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me, because the other staff members started hearing it too. Sometimes, the sound of something dragging across the old floors of the house would make us freeze. But when we went to check, there was nothing. The silence would return, as if nothing had happened. But the worst was yet to come. One morning, one of the girls, Maria, appeared with scratched and bloody hands, as if she had tried to climb a concrete wall, her fingers nearly broken. She couldn't explain what had happened. The words coming out of her mouth made no sense. She talked about a dark place, and how Lucas had called her. I knew it wasn't possible, because no one had seen Lucas since that night, but Maria, she was right. Something was calling the children. Something was moving in the shadows. And deep down, I knew the orphanage was no longer a safe place. One night the same blackout occurred. But this time, there were no children screaming, no panic. The orphanage was dead, in a dense, suffocating silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I walked through the dark corridors, the candlelight flickering weakly in my hands, my heart pounding as if it knew it was being followed. When I passed by the old library, I heard a strange noise coming from the back, from the basement. It was a dragging sound, as if someone was sliding down the stairs. I knew I shouldn't go there. Fear spread in my chest, but something pushed me in that direction. A visceral feeling that if I didn't go, I would never escape. I descended slowly, the sound growing louder with each step. My body was tense, my muscles aching from holding out to fear. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, a faint light emanated from beneath the door. It wasn't a normal light, but something that seemed to pulse, as if vibrating in tune with the darkness itself. I touched the doorknob and upon opening, found something I would never forget. The basement was alive. There were children, but they weren't the children from the orphanage. They were arranged in a circle, motionless, their eyes fixed on the center where something moved. Something I couldn't see immediately. When I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The children were in a trance, their pale and dirty skin marked with deep scratches, as if torn by claws. But the most frightening thing was their expression. Their eyes weren't empty like Lucas's. No, they were filled with something dark. And in the center of the circle was a figure. Lucas, or what was left of him. His body lay stretched on the floor, but it was no longer in human form. His legs were twisted, as if broken and reconfigured at an impossible angle. His hands were deformed, with long, thin fingers, almost non-existent, and his skin was covered in a viscous black substance, as if something had emerged from within him, corroding his flesh. He was breathing, but not in a normal way. It was a deep, grotesque sound, as if the air was being sucked in rather than expelled. When I looked closer, I realized he was staring at me, his eyes now completely black, devoid of pupils, as if all that was within him was a deep darkness. He knew I was there. And then he spoke, in a voice that was not his, but something much older, darker. "Now you are part of us." Terror engulfed me in a way I never imagined possible. The fear came not just from what I saw, but from a much deeper sensation, a feeling that something was being summoned, something that should not exist, and that now, I was about to be consumed by it. At that moment, reality seemed to unravel, as if time and space had been eroded by the presence of that entity. I felt the air grow thicker, denser, as if the walls of the orphanage were closing in around me. That was the last time I saw Lucas, or whatever he had become. I ran out of there, but I knew something had followed me. I dare not return to the orphanage. I know this did not end with my escape. Lucas was not alone. He never was. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the storm seems close, I hear the sound of footsteps, and a faint laugh, coming from somewhere in the shadows. Something is lurking. Something is waiting. And I know I am no longer safe. And believe me, either are you. I tried to move on. I tried, in every way possible, to erase that night from my mind. But the weight of what I saw in the orphanage, the images of that basement, could not be dissipated. The children were still there, within those walls, and Lucas, or what remained of him, was still inside them. Or in something deeper. Something I couldn't comprehend. I spent months trying to bury the fear. I moved to a distant city, trying to find some sense of normalcy. But it was impossible. It didn't take long for things to start happening. Things I could no longer ignore. It began with dreams. And they were not ordinary dreams. Each night, I saw the figure of Lucas. He was always in a dark place, an environment where light could not reach. His black, impenetrable eyes followed me wherever I went, and every time he stared at me, I felt a presence drawing closer. Something that was waiting to possess. I was being called. That sensation I felt before in the orphanage began to manifest again, but now, in a sharper, more visceral way. I felt something moving inside me, a black hole that slowly took over my mind, my soul. As if that place, that basement, had left a mark on me, an indelible mark. And then, the worst happened. One night, while walking through the city, I saw something that froze me completely. I passed by a narrow alley, where a dim light shone from a dirty window. When I looked inside, I saw a figure. A child. Or what seemed to be a child. It stood still in a dark corner. The gaze was that of Lucas, or something very similar. The eyes were black, dull, lifeless, yet I knew it was him. Or something of him. It wasn't just the appearance. It was the feeling. That same feeling that something was moving beneath the surface. Something that couldn't be seen but could be felt. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I could only stare at that child as it looked at me with a suffocating intensity, as if it knew exactly who I was, as if it had been waiting for me all along. That's when I heard the sound of something heavy dragging on the floor, coming from the shadows behind me. The sound was unnatural, not human. It was the sound of something sliding, as if the very air were being pulled into something much larger, much deeper. A chill ran up my spine, and suddenly I knew. I knew I wasn't alone. The presence, the same one I had felt at the orphanage, was now behind me, watching me with the patience of a dark eternity. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just emptiness. Silence. I heard the laughter. But it wasn't a child's. It wasn't Lucas. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. I ran. I ran like never before. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. I couldn't. But the sound of footsteps, or drags, was getting closer, ever closer. I knew it wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The thing, the entity, the presence, was near me, closer than I ever imagined. I reached my house and locked all the doors and windows, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I felt as if someone was inside me, as if my own mind had become the refuge of something that shouldn't exist. Something that was now taking control of every thought, every gesture, every breath. And then, the children began to appear. They were everywhere. They weren't the same as before. They were different, distorted, with empty stares, but with something more, something alive within them. And always, wherever I went, there was laughter, a soft, hissing laughter, as if it were being shared by all those figures. I knew what they were saying. You will never escape. Not again. And it was in that moment, at the peak of terror, that I began to understand. The orphanage wasn't just a place of past horrors. It was a point of connection. A point between the world of the living and something else. Something that had been unleashed through something as simple as Lucas's death. It wasn't him watching us. It wasn't him whispering. It was something much greater, something much older and malevolent. Something that had somehow found a bridge between the worlds. And with each night, the presence grew. The weight of his existence thrived through my life, tearing apart my sanity, corroding everything around me. I could no longer differentiate reality from nightmares. The faces of the children followed me wherever I went. I could hear the echo of their laughter, ever closer. They were consuming me, becoming part of me. I can't hide anymore. I can't run anymore. I am trapped in this cycle, this game of shadows and laughter. And now, I know that the only way to end all this, to break from this distorted reality, is to look into Lucas's eyes again. To look at him, at what he has become. Because he is no longer just in the orphanage's basement. He is inside me, and he is waiting. The darkness will never leave me. It will swallow me. I no longer knew what was real. Days and nights blended into a continuous nightmare. I couldn't distinguish the sound of my own breath from those laughs. The children, the shadows, everything became a distorted mass of images haunting me. They were inside me, consuming me, destroying me from within. I tried to escape, but there was nowhere left to go. I tried to call for help, but everyone told me I was crazy. They didn't hear what I heard. They didn't see what I saw. I could no longer trust my mind. Or maybe the truth was that my mind was already completely distorted, utterly dominated by something I couldn't comprehend. And then, one night, I decided to face it once and for all. I went to the orphanage. That cursed place that had given rise to all this. I knew that if I wanted to end this nightmare, I would have to go to the source. There was no escaping anymore. When I arrived, the orphanage was different. There were no lights, no sounds, no muffled presence of children. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. The same feeling I had years ago was there, enveloping me again. I entered through the main door, which creaked as it opened. The air was cold, the room seemed empty, but the silence was deafening. I knew that with every step, with every movement, I was getting closer to the final point. That's when I heard the whisper. Not from a child, not from Lucas, but from something deeper, something that did not belong to this world. You have finally returned. The voice came from somewhere beyond the darkness. I looked around, but there was no one. Just a shadow that seemed to move on its own, as if it were a living entity, formless, faceless. It was as if the very shadows of the orphanage were alive, as if the entire building were a thirsty entity, waiting for someone like me. Someone willing to surrender, to get lost for good. And then, the lights went out. What happened next, I have no words to describe. I felt something approaching me, touching my skin, as if invisible fingers were tracing my body. I wanted to scream, but my throat was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but feel the weight of the presence enveloping me. The laughter. Now I knew it didn't come from a child. It didn't come from Lucas. It came from within me. I was hearing my own voice, distorted and filled with rage, echoing against the walls of the orphanage. "They never leave," said the voice, which now sounded like a collective whisper, as if hundreds of souls were speaking through me. "They are all inside you. They are in you. You are one of them now." The walls began to move. The shadows twisted and contorted like snakes, trapping me in a cold, tight embrace. I could feel my body being dragged to the floor, as if something was pulling me into a boundless pit, into a deep darkness where there was no escape. And that's when I saw, in the center of the room, Emerging from the shadows, Lucas appeared. Or what was left of him. His body was distorted, mutilated, but his eyes, those eyes, were alive. They were looking directly at me. And for the first time, I didn't see just pain in them. There was something more. Something darker. Something that had taken control of him, that had transformed him. And before I could react, he spoke, but not with words. He didn't need to. I felt it. It was the sensation of being swallowed by something unattainable, something that wasn't human. It was as if I were being absorbed by a black hole of pure darkness, and the voices of the children, the laughter, the whisper, everything was becoming one single scream echoing inside me. I knew now. I hadn't escaped. I could never escape. I was no longer alive. I was no longer dead. I was part of the orphanage. I was part of that entity that should never have been unleashed. And now, like all the other lost souls, I was trapped there forever. The laughter echoed, louder, higher, until it merged with the sound of the darkness that was now taking over everything. And in that final moment, I finally understood. I had always been the child of the darkness,